Good afternoon. Let me start my presentation today by thanking the organizers, most importantly for inviting me to share my experience with you with respect to regulation in the perspective of the African continent. Well, when we talk about regulation, this is how I tend to understand it, that as a regulator, set the rules of the game and enforce compliance with respect to the rules of that game. And therefore, to be an effective regulator, you have to be able to understand the game for which you have to set the rules. That is the starting point. If you don't understand the rules of the game, then probably you are not going to be able to set the right rules, and you may not be able to even effectively monitor compliance with respect to those rules. So, the unfortunate bit is that we are not the players on the field. Since morning, we have listened to people who are developing projects, people who are players on the field, but we are not the players on the field. We only set the rules and enforce compliance with those rules. And you have heard from all the previous presentations, negative reserve margin for the SAP, a power supply crisis on the African continent, and what we may need to ask ourselves is whether the regulatory environment has any role to play in helping Africa come out of the current power supply crisis. And my answer at this stage is that yes, regulation, effective regulation is key to the development of the power sector on the African continent. Regulation in the context of the African continent is quite something that is new and recent. Tomorrow started in the mid-90s, and a number of other countries started adopting this in the late 1990s. But of course, for the USA, it started much, much earlier, and many other countries started adopting regulation starting with the 1980s. We may need at this point pause a little bit and ask ourselves and say, why all this fuss for a regulator? You know, I normally say regulators are needed where there is an element of market failure. And I think that is the point of departure, that wherever you are likely to face market failure, then you may need a regulator. And we know that infrastructure industries, traditionally, they are considered natural monopolies, and the result of that, the market may not be efficient in allocation, in allocation of the resources. The monopolist is likely to abuse its significant market power, and therefore you may need an external agency, a quasi-public body that is going to be able to regulate the market. There are expectations with respect to regulation, and if you are doing effective regulation, you need to be aware that market participants have a lot of expectations in you. First of all, to protect consumers from abuse of market power. Secondly, support investment by protecting investors from arbitrary action by government. Lastly, but not least, to promote economic efficiency. And this is what regulators strive to achieve when they are doing their work. Okay. As regulators perform their functions, normally there are key principles under which this should be done. And I think there is general consensus today as to what constitutes the principles of best practice regulation. Clarity of laws, independence, transparency and accountability, participation, consistency, predictability, flexibility, the competence and capacity of a regulator have all been identified as key important principles of good regulation. Okay. I will leave this slide. When you are a regulator, the first key challenge that you face is how to balance the interests of the various stakeholders. What I have found very interesting is that almost all regulators know that they are various stakeholders. And when you ask any regulator, he will tell you, I have 3 stakeholders, okay? He will say government, he will say the consumer, and then he will add on other players. And mainly these other players include the investors in the sector, okay? Behind the investors, though, we all know that there will always be a lender behind, okay, who also needs the protection of effective regulation. So those key players are known, those key stakeholders are known, but what I find as a challenge in regulation is that much as we know these stakeholders, our challenge has always been, how do you balance the interests of all these stakeholders? That's where the game or the art of regulation starts from. Consumers want low prices, but they also want good quality of service. Investors want a guaranteed fair rate of return. Therefore, they want cost-reflective tariffs. And that runs contrary to what the consumers want. Government has other objectives, including redistribution, special tariffs for low incomes, as we know, faster connections, and increased access. So if you are increasing the tariffs, think about a government which is concerned about redistribution, okay? All these interests are often conflicting. And this is a challenge we have faced as regulators on the continent, how best we can balance this, because the failure to balance these interests often result into other undesirable consequences. And in any case, they affect the effectiveness of regulation. As a result, you find that in most of the countries on the African continent, governments have failed to resist the temptation of interfering with the regulatory processes and the decision that they take. It's not uncommon, for instance, to find that governments will reverse certain decisions taken by regulators or delay those decisions to be taken, especially with respect to tariff setting. I can see players from the utility sector, and you know how hard it can be to raise tariffs, okay? But when you go to the primary registrations, you'll always find clauses which gives these regulators independence and autonomy, okay? But are they really independent? And independent from who? I have looked at a number of registrations, even including those from developed countries. When it comes to this clause of independence, you always find that they leave room for further interpretation. They don't close it up, okay? Because in our case, yes, you are independent. There is a clause to give you the independence, but there is another clause which says the minister can issue a policy directive as long as it does not substantially interfere. Now, you leave that word substantial can be a subject of debate, isn't it? When it comes to transparency and accountability, which is the key aspect of effective regulation, this is an area I think that as regulators we are not faring very well. And transparency is something that is subject to a lot of interpretations, and I don't think that we have come to really agreeing on exactly what transparency means. Now, if you ask most of the regulators on the continent, or you go to their websites, I have visited some websites, you would hardly find regulators publishing their decisions and the reasons underlying those decisions. Yet, one key tenet of transparency is that you should be able to publish as a regulator your decisions and what informed those decisions. But we hardly do that. You hardly find annual reports published on these websites, and ask yourself how much information can you easily find on these websites. The other challenge that I have experienced as a regulator and seen other regulators faced with is the aspect of participation and communication and the whole consultation process. How do you design an effective communication and consultation process as a regulator to be able to bring all the stakeholders, participate in the whole regulatory process. It's quite a challenge. Are you going to hold a public hearing? How many people are going to attend a public hearing? Are you going to go to each region of the country? Are you going to be on the radio? Are you going to be on the TV? How are you designing your whole communication and consultation strategy? I normally say that the key risk to regulation is the failure of the key stakeholders understanding you as a regulator, how you do your work, how you do you arrive at certain decisions, okay, and what informs those decisions. And I think that is an area where we are still failing as a regulator, and it's quite challenging, I would say. Competence is something you cannot ignore, okay, because you need financial resources, and when you look at all the regulators on the continent, very few have substantial resources to be able to carry out their mandate. You'll find that most of these regulatory agencies have staff ranging from 10 to 50 something. Maybe if you go to the NERISA, they can go to 125 staff, but most of these have fewer staff. But even those who have sufficient staff, how about the skills? Do they have the right skills? Okay. And that's the issue of the quality of the staff vis-a-vis quantity also is an issue that need to be looked at. Clarity of laws, I think this is one area that where regulators also have a challenge, and this is where, if you want effective regulation, we need to address this one. The laws of the ministry vis-a-vis the law of a regulator remains bad in most countries, okay? And I will give you a simple example. You will always find that the ministry has a great interest in the tariffs, okay? And regulator under the law will be telling you you have the independence in as far as setting tariffs is concerned, and you are not under the control and the authority of anybody, right? But when it comes to setting these tariffs, remember the ministry has an interest and government overall has an interest, okay? Don't forget the fact that the customer is equal to the voter, and that still holds true. The other aspect, of course, where we still have challenges in terms of clarity of laws is with respect to planning and procurement of the new projects. Okay, who is responsible, who takes the lead, what is the role of regulation in all this process? If you are regulating tariffs, what was your role in the tariff for this project that was procured? Did you play any role? Can you say no to this tariff? Okay. Enforcement. Okay, as I said, regulators set rules and enforce those rules to ensure that the players play within the set of those rules. But you will always find that under the laws that we have in place, very few give these regulators sufficient powers to be able to enforce the compliance. Okay? And we need to give regulators strong legal mandate under the law to be able to enforce compliance. So what I would say, therefore, is that the regulators on the continent, much as effective regulation is necessary, they are still facing a number of challenges. We have interference by governments in the processes, but also in the decisions of the regulators. And a reverse of regulatory decisions and sacking of commissioners on the continent is not uncommon, isn't it? A number of the regulators on the continent have had their commissioners sacked, boards changed, and etc. Okay? The law will be there. When you read most of these laws, I have read quite a number, they seem to protect the commissioners, but it doesn't stop government from, it has the other hand from interfering and doing this. Lack of clarity on some laws, as I said, between the regulator and the government, the poorly functioning legal system, okay? Because you can enforce compliance fine, but that will depend on how strong and effective your legal system is. And a good regulatory law does not substitute for a weak overall judicial system. So the judicial system is as good as having a good legal, regulatory framework. Inadequate financial and human resources, and also repeated macroeconomic crisis. Okay, You can have all the skills you need as a regulator. You can have all the resources, but if there is macroeconomic crisis, for instance, you have your exchange rate depreciate by 30% in less than 1 year, and you have all these, you are regulating by contracts, you have all these indexation clauses under the power purchase agreements. What are you going to do as a regulator? Is the tariff going to increase by 30%? And who is going to accept it? Okay, will you get any support anyway? If you're operating in a corrupt environment and you are a regulator, where are you going to get your staff who are not corrupt? Okay, and that could affect your effectiveness. The market structure challenges are also a common feature when it comes to the functioning of the regulators on the continent. Most of the regulators have adopted a single buyer model, but how effective is the single buyer model? Okay. If this single buyer or this off-taker has financial constraints, okay, with whom is this IPP going to execute a PPA? Okay, and who is going to pay for this power if this IPP has financial constraints, right? Weak penalties, okay? Weak penalties. You find that under the law, the penalties are weak or sometimes not adequately provided for. I have seen instances where licensees simply refuse to submit data to the regulator and say, what do you have to do? What can you do? Okay, because they are weak penalties under the law, and that becomes very difficult. What I would say, therefore, in conclusion, is that, yes, effective regulation is necessary. We need it, okay? And the regulators on the African continent have been struggling because of the environment within which they are operating. Regulation is not there for its own sake. Regulation is there to make sure that it affects industry outcomes in a positive manner, okay? And regulation alone is not going to solve the power supply crisis or the challenges that we are faced with in the power sector. We need other things to be right, okay? And we have to look at it in a holistic manner. So we should be looking at trying to adopt a mechanism to enhance transparency, accountability, and also to improve communication as regulators. And we also need support from governments. The governments, the consumers, and other stakeholders need to appreciate the role of regulation for it to work. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your listening.